Warning, this video will contain spoilers for everything How to Train Your Dragon, the movies, the shows, the shorts, even the 2 comics. Recently, I was re-watching the second How to Train Your Dragon film, and there was something that struck me as odd. During the funeral of Stoic the Vast, Hiccup cast the flaming arrow using a right-handed bow, but we know from the first film that he is in fact left-handed. Him being left-handed was one of the first things I discovered about him, and it made me fall for his character even more, partly because I'm also left-handed, and also in part due to the fact that it kind of plays into his character of being different from everyone else. Initially, I dismissed this thinking, you know what, kind of makes sense. Given the circumstances, there would probably only be a right-handed bow available, and thank goodness he happens to be a good shot on the right hand. But then I realized that he uses his right hand a lot when wielding his flaming dragon blade, and thus I had to ask myself, could Hiccup Haddock be ambidextrous? Hey y'all, I'm the Geek Apprentice, and oh my gosh, this video has been in the works for well over a month. Why? Because in order to answer my question, I had to meticulously skim through and make extensive notes on every single bit of canon How to Train Your Dragon media. All 3 films, all 4 shorts, both TV series Defenders and Riders of Berk, and Race to the Edge, and even the 2 comics I discovered that were written by director, writer, and co-producer of the films, Dean DeBluey, which take place between the 2nd and 3rd film. It was quite the marathon, and I enjoyed every bit of it, even though I knew by the time I got to the 2nd and 3rd film I was just going to end up sobbing because they touched me so much, but anyway. This was a journey that took me to some very unexpected places in my research. So let's begin. The research. Being ambidextrous versus just being decently handy with both hands. Before I could come to any conclusions about what I would end up finding in rewatching everything, I needed to make sure I truly understood what being ambidextrous is. Though I must clarify, I am not an expert in this. I did a ton of research, don't get me wrong, but I'm not an expert. This is all just for fun. Based on what I've found, let me tell you, there are probably tons of people in this world who think they're ambidextrous, but they're really not. Here's the thing. There are many left-handed people that might think that they are ambidextrous simply because they're fairly comfortable with using their right hand in certain areas of life. This, of course, is in part due to the fact that we live in a right-handed world and thus have had to adapt in some ways. The other confusion is that the brain of someone who is ambidextrous is extremely similar to that of someone who is left-hand dominant. 75 to 90% of the Earth's population is right-handed, and this comes from the fact that they mainly use the left hemisphere of their brain. And no, that's not a mistake. Those of you who have taken psychology probably know that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, which is where we get the joke, lefties are in their right mind. But the science actually says differently for lefties. The other 10 to 25%, whether they are left-handed or ambidextrous, actually use both sides pretty equally. So it's no wonder so many left-handed people believe they're ambidextrous. What does it mean to be ambidextrous then? In addition to the brain hemisphere usage, one who is ambidextrous cannot truly tell which hand is dominant. Sure, they might use one hand more than the other for certain tasks, but if you ask them which is dominant, they won't be certain. Most likely they'll end up using their right hand for a lot of things in life because that's just easier than trying to find a left-handed desk, left-handed scissors, left-handed bow and arrow, left-handed golf clubs. The list goes on. Can't you train yourself to become ambidextrous? Maybe, but depending on what you're reading, the jury seems to be out on that. In fact, some scientists believe that it's actually not healthy to try and force yourself to become ambidextrous, especially if you are right-hand dominant, seeing as your brain is not predisposed to using both hemispheres so strongly. Not sure why, I'm not a scientist. And while it's argued that many lefties trained themselves into becoming ambidextrous all those years ago when lefties were looked at like demons, I mean, even the word left in most languages means wrong or demonic. The point is, they probably actually just trained themselves into being comfortable with their right hand, but in fact are still left hand dominant. Also, and I believe this has to do with the brain hemisphere thing, there are many lefties such as myself that certain tasks, we actually do find the right-handed way to be far easier, It doesn't make us ambidextrous though. More on that at the end. Obviously, there is so much more to this than I originally thought, and seeing as being ambidextrous is extremely rare, not to mention the criteria for it is so hard to pinpoint, answering this question is going to be a little difficult. Going through everything How to Train Your Dragon. I started my analysis by going through all of the How to Train Your Dragon works in chronological order. The first How to Train Your Dragon film, the first 3 shorts, the TV series Defenders and Riders of Berk, the 4th short, then the Netflix series Dragon's Race to the Edge, the 2nd film, the 2 comics written by Dean DeBluey, and finally, The Hidden World. While I wrote down pretty much anything and everything that looked like Hiccup preferring one hand over the other, in the end, I just had to use my best personal judgment to decide what would be relevant or not. In addition, I ended up needing to look at how other characters handled things, seeing as they would sometimes switch hands too. Probably for convenience. Also, before I get into my findings, I want to point out that I 100% recognize that in many cases, especially concerning the TV shows and the shorts, how Hiccup prefers one hand over the other might just come down to how the animators animated that gesture. There may not have been any thoughts given to Hiccup's preferred hand, especially if they were trying to go for a certain look or blocking in a scene. However, that kind of takes the fun out of it, so we might ignore that a little bit. Lastly, I would like to clarify that the films are going to take precedence on certain things due to the fact that they had every single detail considered. I mean, you watch interviews and rewatch the movies with the director, animator commentaries, and dang, they really did think of everything when it came to the films. When it comes to the 3 films, no detail was haphazard. Now for the findings. So I'm going to give you the numbers for hand preference, and just so you know, all of the decimals are being rounded up or rounded down to the nearest decimal. Basic math, you know. Taking into account everything from his preferred hand for sweeping to riding and combat, Hiccup preferred his left hand at roughly 62%, only using his right hand about 38% of the time. But that's not shocking, is it? We know he's left-handed. He has been since the first film whenever we saw him write. And though I will say 62 to 38 is a lot more even than most would turn out to be, I expect, overall hand preference isn't enough. Sure, he may write and sketch with his left hand, and we see him do that a lot, but let's say he uses his right hand more when he's sword fighting. Sure, we don't see him doing it a lot, but still holds significance. Thus, at this point, I had to start separating everything I had tracked down into categories. Writing and sketching is always left hand, save for 2 random times we see him use his right hand to briefly sketch something in Dragon's Race to the Edge. Based on the number of times we see him writing or sketching, this works out to 92% left-handed. Looking at menial random little things such as cleaning, he prefers his left at 70%. Eating utensils, yes, this is actually somewhat important. See, while the use of a fork and knife is slightly different between the UK and the US, the one thing they have the same is that they use the fork in the left hand and the knife in the right hand. The difference being in the US, after they cut, they switch to the right hand. I don't know. And obviously I couldn't find any history on Viking eating utensils, so this is what I have to go off of. And this was news to me, seeing as I apparently eat the UK right-handed way. I always hold my fork in my left hand. I mean, just makes sense to me. That said, the UK and the US do use a spoon in whatever their dominant hand is. Since eating and drinking is seen so little throughout the series, I'm just combining all of it, and the numbers are dictated by which hand he used for that specific utensil. And don't worry about the whole fork and knife thing. We never see him use a knife. Ever. Not when eating. So with that in mind, Hiccup prefers his left hand for spoon, fork, and cup at 70%. Now when it comes to crafting, inventing, smithing, and overall handiness, he prefers his left barely over his right at 52%. Though I will point out, 35% of all of his crafting throughout everything is in the films alone, where he only uses his left hand. Combat and combat weapons, including his flaming dragon blade and archery. This one is so close to even, the left hand barely coming out on top at 51%. However, now we need to look at these weapons separately, namely his dragon blade, the one item he uses extensively in the latter 2 films. The numbers show that for the dragon blade, Hiccup prefers at 62% his right hand. This is a complete flip from his overall hand preference, which is 62% left-handed. I will say though, if you're only looking at the films, it gets a little odd. In the second film, he uses his dragon blade evenly between both hands. The holster for his dragon blade is on his right leg, not his right hip, which would suggest it being for his left hand like you would any sword, but again, his right leg, meaning it's easy access for his right hand. But he used them evenly. But in the final film, he mostly uses his left hand, meaning that he was taking it out with his right and then immediately switching it to his left. But what about archery? You know, the thing that kind of set this whole idea and question into motion. Well, like I said at the beginning, I kind of assumed that of course he was going to use his right hand because that's probably all that was there. Right-handed bows. And yes, there is a difference. I had to look it up. However, when you go back through everything, even though he only uses a bow and a crossbow a total of 6 times, 4 of those times are with his right. Now at this point I was getting real weary and confused until I looked at the numbers for his telescope usage, or whatever he calls it. He calls it something else. Originally, I was going to toss this information seeing as I saw other characters kind of go back and forth on which eye they use. Admittedly, he uses his left eye a smidge more at 56%, but like I mentioned earlier, the movies will matter a tad more seeing as every detail was looked into, and even the comics, since Dean DeBluey had a direct hand in them. And which eye does he use in the movie and comics? Only his right. This changes everything. Yes, that was a callback to Race to the Edge. So this spurred a bunch of other questions. Well, at least 2. Once I noticed how often he used his right eye, especially in the more canon works, I mean, they're all canon, but anyway, it got me asking, do we have a dominant eye? And if we do, does that make a difference when it comes to things like archery? First of all, yes, we do have a dominant eye, and crazy enough, I actually am right eye dominant. Weird. If you want to figure out which eye is your dominant eye, I'll put a link to the explanation in the description below. Second, absolutely, eye dominance has huge importance when it comes to archery. While you can obviously just keep both eyes open when shooting a bow, many like to just use their dominant eye for the sake of accuracy. And if you're left eye dominant, but you're using your right arm, it kind of defeats the purpose because your left hand's in the way. Therefore, many right-handed people with left dominant eyes will actually learn how to shoot a bow and arrow with their left so they can get that perfect accuracy. Again, which arm does Hiccup prefer for archery? His right. And while he probably had to learn all hand-specific weaponry with his right anyway, seeing as the weapons on Berk were probably mainly right-handed because most people were right-handed, it probably made the process a lot easier if he was in fact right eye dominant. Even if you take into account all of the media, which does suggest that he uses his left eye a little bit more for the telescope, the fact that we know he's more comfortable on the right for archery suggests that if we got to see him use his telescope more, he would probably end up being right eye dominant. That's my guess anyway. So now we can attempt to answer the question, is Chief Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III ambidextrous? I don't think so. If for no other reason that there's just not enough evidence to look at to come to a clear answer, even with 3 movies, 4 shorts, 2 comics, and 2 shows. That on top of the fact that he is in fact left-hand dominant when it comes to writing and sketching, the main telltale sign of which hand someone prefers, or both. Also, given that being ambidextrous is extremely rare, even though that would fit the character theme of Hiccup, if you will, it's so complicated to try and figure out if someone is in fact ambidextrous. It would be too far of a stretch to even say that he definitely might be ambidextrous. Hiccup is still left-hand dominant, which makes sense given his creativity and inventiveness. Not saying you can't be creative and right-handed, but there's science backing up that left-handed people tend to be more creative. It's cool stuff. It just so happens that in some areas, some tasks, Hiccup does prefer his right hand, while in other areas he's pretty even split between his left and his right. And this is actually quite common among lefties. For example, the moment I started looking into learning how to play the guitar, I knew that I would prefer the right hand even though I'm very left-hand dominant. Why? The reason is because I knew I wanted my stronger left hand doing the complicated fretwork while my weaker right hand just kind of strum. This is also why I can't play piano very well, I think, because on piano, your right hand is the one doing all of this stuff and your left hand does mainly chords, so I just didn't pick up on it very well. My main point is that while Hiccup is pretty dang versatile on which hand he uses, he is still left hand dominant, and that versatility in hand preference is just kind of how lefties are. Sometimes it's just because we live in a right-handed world and have to adapt in some ways, while at other times because we use both hemispheres of our brain pretty darn evenly, for some skills, the right-handed way just ends up being easier. Who knows? Brains are weird, cool, interesting, and complicated organs. And hey, if you are a fellow lefty out there, be sure to let me know in the comment section below, and let me know if there are any things that you happen to prefer your right hand with. Y'all, this is probably some of the most fun I've ever had getting ready for a video. I mean, a month-long How to Train Your Dragon marathon? Heck yeah! That said, so many stinking hours were put into the research of this video, not just for the How to Train Your Dragon marathon, but also educating myself on matters such as the brain, eye dominance, archery, etc. Not to mention all of the hours sifting through my data and findings to get numbers, analyze them, and come to my own conclusion. I think if I did the math correctly, it all came to about 50 to 60 hours for everything. And that's before recording this video and editing it, which takes 4 to 7 hours, depending, I don't know. But it's fun, I enjoy it. So if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and following me on Twitch and Instagram, where I will post hints sometimes for videos. And if you guess the hint correctly, like exactly correctly, your name will appear on the screen, like hopefully some names appear right now. They might not. There might also be people listed in the description because they got the theme right but not the specific topic. Some people tried to guess the specific topic like I wanted them to, but they at least got that it was How to Train Your Dragon, while others just said How to Train Your Dragon, which is right but not completely right, so their names will be in the description. I thought the emoji hints were pretty obvious, but maybe not. My love and passion for How to Train Your Dragon knows no bounds, and if you're also a passionate geek, whatever it might be, then maybe consider checking out these other videos of mine. But that is all for today. Thank you for watching.